Hey, this is Rob from Producer Tech, and in this series of movies, I'm going to take you through some different effects processing techniques, including looking at some slightly lesser known devices in live and some unique ways of manipulating sound. In this first movie though, I wanted to cover some of the main principles of effects processing, so you have a good grasp of the basics before we move on to specific techniques. To start with then, there are two main ways to use an effect, as an insert or a send effect. Typically, an insert effect is added directly to a track, so processes the entire signal on the track, which you would want to do, for example, when getting control over the dynamics with a compressor, or the frequencies with an EQ or filter. So with this loop then, I could use compression to squash the peaks, and therefore level out the dynamics so the volume doesn't go up and down as much. And so, after I turn it up, it's then louder all of the time, without fading away to almost nothing in between each chord in the phrase. And then I could use an EQ to remove some of the bass perhaps, to free up some room for other bassy sounds in the mix. So this is an example of how you might want to shape and sculpt a track with insert effects to make it work in your mix. Now let's say you wanted to add some reverb to these congas here. Well, you could add the reverb directly to the track as an insert. But the problem with this is, the only control you have over the amount of the effect is the dry-wet dial. So if you want more reverb, you need to turn that up, which increases the wet, reverberant sound, but decreases the dry, non-reverberant sound. So what can often work better for an effect like this, or a chorus, or something that adds width or depth to a track, is to have it on a return track, which are these ones at the end here. These can easily be changed just like any other track, just by adding and removing effects in the normal way. Or I can create a new return track and then drag over the reverb to it. So it's now on that track and not the conga track itself. Then I need to make sure I don't forget to set the effect to 100%, so fully wet, so all we hear on that track is the affected sound. You always need to make sure this is the case when you have an effect on a return track. And now, to process the congas with that effect, I just need to turn up the send dial on the track, so dial C, which then routes whatever amount of the signal I set to that return track. And the advantage now is that I can bring the amount of reverb on the signal up and down with the return track fader, or the send dial, without affecting the dry signal on the track, so it stays nice and clear in the mix without disappearing off into the distance. Other advantages to using a send effect on a return track are that other tracks can be processed by it too, so I could send some of the pad to the reverb as well. And this has several benefits. Firstly, it helps gel your mix when multiple tracks are processed by the same effect. And secondly, it can help save CPU, which isn't such a big deal if using Live's reverb here, but can be if you're using CPU-intensive third-party effects plugs. And additionally, using a send effect is essential if wanting to only process part of a signal. For example, just the upper frequencies. For instance, if wanting to add reverb to the top end of the drums now, then we could first turn up the send dial, so we're sending the drums to the reverb. But then we'd need to filter or EQ the sound on the return track to get rid of the bottom end, so we don't have a reverberant kick drum. So now we have the top end of the drums with reverb, which can be blended in using the send dial on the track. And obviously, this wouldn't be possible with an insert reverb directly on the track, as we'd need to keep those lower drums frequencies in the mix. Some final points. Firstly, the pre and post switches for send dials simply signify whether the level on the send dial takes into account the fader setting on the track. For example, you may have the level of a track set very low in the mix, in which case, in the default post setting, which is post fader, so after the signal has been turned down loads by the fader, then the send amount will be the quiet one that's been adjusted by the fader. Whereas, if you want to ignore this fader setting on the return track, so have it pre-fader, which will be at full level before the fader's turned it down, then you'll get a much louder signal on the return track. So the pre-post switches give you extra gain flexibility for each return track. Secondly, although I've said that insert effects are added directly to tracks and send effects are on return tracks, there is a way of having parallel processing on an individual track without using returns, and that's with a rack. For example, if I add an audio effect rack to a track and then show the chains list, then I can create two chains in the rack, which is essentially creating a duplicate of the signal on the track, which now runs in parallel to the other. So you have two device chains for the track now, rather than just a single one. So this means I could keep one chain empty, which would be the dry signal, and add a reverb to the second chain. Once again setting it to 100% wet, so we just get the reverb. And then we can use the second chain's level control to bring the reverb in and out, just like when we turned the return track level up and down before. So it's an alternative method for creating the parallel processing you get with the send effect directly on a track's device chain, which can be handy in some situations. And lastly, although I mentioned that effects like a compressor are normally used as inserts, there are some cases where you might like to use them as a send. For instance, if I add a compressor to a new return track and then send the drums to it, and then if I solo the return track and then fatten up the drums by massively over-compressing them, and obviously we wouldn't want our drums to sound like this, but if I mix in just a little with the unprocessed drums, then I can fatten it up nicely. And it can be nice to boost the top end with an EQ when doing this too, so we get the full New York style parallel compression effect. And all of Live's compressors actually have dry-wet dials now too, so you have the option of doing a similar thing when using them as an insert, where you can set them up in a similar heavy way, but only have them slightly wet, rather than the normal 100%. So that was a little intro covering the main principles of effects processing in Live, with a few individual techniques in there too. Next time, I'll move on to some more specific examples of effects processing, looking at grain delay.